Hi, I'm Claire Ridgway, historian and author, and today I'm diving into one of the darker and lesser known rumours about King Henry VIII. When we think about Henry, his 6 wives often take centre stage, but behind them lurks a swirl of gossip, scandal, and stories that blur the line between truth and invention. Some were harmless court tittle-tattle, others were dangerous, even treasonous. And in 1537, one such story landed right on the desk of Thomas Cromwell. This story accused Henry VIII not only of being unfaithful to his third wife, Jane Seymour, but of stealing another man's mistress and keeping her for himself. Is the tale so juicy that it's made its way into Alison Weir's biography of Henry VIII and even onto our TV screens in the Tudors series, where Henry, played by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, casually seizes a young woman while out riding. But what really happened? Well, let's dig in to the evidence. While I was researching crimes in the Tudor period recently, looking into rapes in particular, I stumbled across an inquiry carried out by Thomas Cromwell regarding rumours that the king was an adulterer. Not only that he'd been unfaithful to Jane Seymour, but that he'd taken another man's woman and slept with her. As I dug into the story, it started ringing bells in my mind. I'd come across it on TV and in a non-fiction history book. Now, if you watch Showtime's The Tudors series starring Jonathan Rhys-Meyers as Henry VIII, you may remember a scene in episode 5 of season 2. The episode was called His Majesty's Pleasure and was set in 1535. Sir Thomas More and John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, are arrested, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and executed for their refusal to recognise the king's supremacy. Anne Boleyn miscarries, and a banished Catherine of Aragon is suffering from ill health. Henry VIII is beginning to lose faith in Anne Boleyn and is doubting that she was a virgin when he met her. He's out riding through a forest with his good friend Charles Brandon, a man who has just returned to court following his banishment for not favouring the king's marriage to Anne. The king is sharing his concerns about Anne, how her miscarriage may have been caused by her previous promiscuity, when they encounter a couple riding towards them, a man named William Webbe and his girlfriend Bess. The king's guards order the couple to dismount to greet their king. William bows and Bess curtsies. While William is quick to assure the king that he has permission to ride through the forest, the king is more interested in Bess, uncovering her head and face, kissing her, and then leading her to his horse. The episode then cuts to the king and Bess in bed together, enjoying themselves. Now, you do have to take the Tudors series with a hefty pinch of salt, as it's heavily fictionalised. But the writer Michael Hirst did make use of researchers and did bring many little-known real historical stories to life. Now, I'd come across the story also in Alison Weir's Henry VIII, the King and His Court, a non-fiction book. In her chapter Bound to Obey and Serve, which refers to Queen Jane Seymour's motto, Weir argues against the idea that the king was suffering with impotence by this time, writing, "In fact, there is evidence that in his later years Henry was still indulging his sexual impulses." One piece of evidence that she uses to back this up is the story of William Webbe, and I quote, his mistress. Weir states that in the late 1530s, Webbe was riding with his mistress near the royal palace of Elton when he encountered the king. She goes on to explain that the king took an immediate fancy to the pretty wench, pulled her up on his horse and rode off to the palace, where he ravished her and kept her for some time. She states that Webbe swore vengeance on the king, but there was little he could do apart from tell his story. She cites letters and papers, surviving documents from Henry VIII's reign, but gives no volume or document number. Now, that sounds very close to the scene in the Tudors, doesn't it? The only difference being that Hirst has it taking place during the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn, whereas Weir dates it to the late 1530s and tells the story in her chapter on Jane Seymour. Also, Hurst makes it all consensual, and Weir paints it as something darker, talking about how the girl was ravished. I decided to research this story a bit more, and I came across an article by Shannon McSheffrey called William Webbe's Wench, Henry VIII, History and Popular Culture. This was in the book The Middle Ages on Television, Critical Essays. McSheffrey shares the primary source for this story, a letter written in September 1537 by a man named Henry or Harry Atkinson. She explains that Atkinson was imprisoned in the convict house inside the Westminster Sanctuary. He was complaining to Cromwell about his unjust imprisonment, and he informed the king's right-hand man of a story that had spread through the sanctuary precinct, a story that he knew could be seen as treason. It concerned William Webbe, the keeper of the Westminster Sanctuary, the very man Atkinson was blaming for his plight. Cromwell had to investigate something which constituted treason. I looked in Letters and Papers on British History Online, which isn't complete but does give a summary, and on the 28th of September 1537 there's record of an examination taken by the Abbot of Westminster and Anthony Denny of certain persons by the commandment of my Lord Privy Seal, Thomas Cromwell. Atkinson was questioned and told of how, the previous month, while he was having supper at the house of Robert Brooke of the Westminster Sanctuary, another sanctuary man, Maurice Bull, told him, "There was one rode upon a fair gelding, and a pretty wench behind him, and a king met them, and plucked down her muffler and kissed her, and liked her so well that he took her from him, and so lived and kept her still in adultery, which wench one William Webbe kept 2 years before." Bull stated that it had been Webbe who'd ridden upon the gelding, and the King of England that took the wench from him, as reported by Robert Sharp's wife of Westminster and Kendall, a servant of the King's. When Maurice Bull was questioned, he referred to sanctuaryman Philip Taylor as his authority and said that the incident took place near Elton and that, and I quote, "Webbe cried vengeance on the king and reported it to Kendall, who lives at Launceston in Cornwall, and Sharp of Westminster, and that one Gon or Gun, Taylor, a sanctuaryman, said the king lived in adultery. Another witness, Philip Johnson, alias Taylor, confirmed Atkinson's story, as did another man, James Robbins. A tailor named Nicholas Mann stated that he'd heard Kendall say that William Webbe was a traitor and had said that the king lived in adultery, relating the same story. He'd advised Kendall to report it to the council, and he said that he'd showed it to the Abbot of Westminster. In her article, McSheffrey explains that no judgment was recorded, with it being an unofficial inquiry, but that Cromwell concluded that Robert Sharp had made up the story for malicious purposes because he wanted Webbe out of the way so that he could have his job. The story was completely fictional in Cromwell's view. McSheffrey believes that Hurst's source for the story was Alison Weir's book, because the only other secondary source for this story is a more academic book, G.R. Elton's 1972 Policy and Police, where, contrary to Weir's treatment of the story as fact, Elton just treats it as, in McSheffrey's words, an example of the kinds of rumours that were current in the period after Anne Boleyn's execution, and as evidence for Henry's sensitivity, particularly about his and his queen's sexual reputations. I read Elton's account of the story, and he explains that some sanctuarymen had been jailed by Webbe after this story had been spread, and that Webbe had put them in irons, and that he'd vowed to hang them. Atkinson told of how, when he'd remarked, "Well, Webbe will win his spurs now," that Webbe had imprisoned him too. That's what Atkinson was complaining to Cromwell about. Now, Cromwell's investigation makes no mention of rape. The story spread around accused the king of kissing Webbe's wench, with whom Webbe had lived for more than 2 years, and taking her from Webbe, keeping her for a time, and living in adultery with her. And the scene in the Tudors shows the young woman going quite willingly with the king and rather enjoying herself. It's only Weir's account that accuses the king of ravishing her, something which really does suggest that the king took her by force, that it was kidnap and rape, which gives the story a whole other dimension. Now, I can see why Hurst used it in the Tudors, which of course had to have sex scenes scattered liberally throughout. And I could also see why he changed the timeline the way he did. But I think that we, like Cromwell, have to conclude that it was just a rumour. And as Shannon McSheffrey notes in her article, we also have to realise that unlike the royal court of the Tudor series, Henry's court was not a sexual playground, and that not even in private was his sex life anywhere near as wanton. Those are McSheffrey's words. But what does this story tell us, if anything, about the king's reputation by September 1537? Well, McSheffrey suggests that the story and its lesson that the king was an adulterer was presumably meant and taken as an implicit criticism of the grounds for the execution of Anne Boleyn. And perhaps she's right. Anne had been executed in May 1536, only 17 days after her arrest, on charges so flimsy that even the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, no friend of the Boleyns, was doubtful. There was already gossip about Henry's relationship with Jane Seymour while Anne still lived, and even a ballad circulated. His hasty marriage to Jane just 11 days after Anne's execution only added fuel to the fire. So, by the autumn of 1537, when this rumour about William Webbe's wench was circulating, Henry's moral reputation was already a little bit shaky. Whether the tale was true or not, it tapped into a wider unease about the king's behaviour, his infidelity, his ruthlessness, and the troubling double standards that had cost a queen her life. And in the end, that may be the real value of this story. Not that it proves Henry's guilt or innocence, but that it shows how vulnerable his reputation had become, and how quickly whispers of adultery or worse could spread, even about the most powerful man in England. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Tudor scandal and rumour, do give this video a like, hit subscribe and join my channel membership for even more exclusive Tudor history content. I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.